Hi, Lou Pulsfer here to talk about the 10 steps to designing a game. Now, I'm not going to say anything I haven't said in other contexts. This is kind of a summary. And there are a few things I want to say before I start on the 10. This is about game design, not about the business of game design. So there's nothing in here about marketing, for example, or licensing. 2, while I list these functions in order because I have to choose some order, many actually take place at the same time. You don't stop getting ideas when you're playing the game in your mind's eye. You don't stop getting ideas when you're playing a prototype. Third, don't think this is easy. It's not something you can do by rote. More than anything else, game design is critical thinking, and that can be hard. So here's the list of 10. I'm not going to read them here. I'm going to take each one and go through it. First, generate viable ideas. Viable meaning ones that might be useful. Now, don't think you just sit there and wait for these ideas to come in out of the blue. You've got to work at getting ideas because volume is necessary. You're not going to rely on just one idea or a few ideas if you're smart, because most of your ideas will not pan out. That's the way it is. That's the way it is for all creative people. Ask a novelist, and they'll tell you they have far more ideas for books than they have time to write. The same thing with game designers. Now, when you get these ideas, write them down. Write them down. Do not fail to write them down. Because if you don't write them down, you will lose many of them, and some of them you'll never get again. And after you've written them down, back it up. Even paper can be backed up. You can take photographs of your paper, but the ideal is to have it on computer. Write them down and back it up. Because they're written down, you'll be able to read them, and that'll actually stimulate more ideas. Now, don't work at trying to find something unique, because there are very few unique things in games. You might run across something that you think is unique, but it turns out people were doing it 20 years ago. It's the combinations of things that result in good games. Games are not ideas. They're a lot more than just ideas. Then you have the step of originating an actual game. There are lots of ways to start this, and one is to ask yourself questions. Are you making a model of something to represent something, or is it an abstraction? Is there going to be human opposition or not? Many people divide games into 2 or 3 types. Some people say all games are math. Usually they're actually referring to puzzles. Some people say that games are about people, and some people say games are all about stories, which can be a subset of people. What kind of game do you want to make? At the same time, you can ask yourself, are you a fiction writer or a game designer? Are you trying to make an interactive fiction, or are you trying to make a game? They're two different things. Or you can start with one of these 5 elements, the theme, quote unquote, because it's a word that means zillions of different things to different people. So, story, a title, a model, an atmosphere, an image, an experience. Or you can start with mechanics. Or you can start from a particular game or a game system or even a genre and work from there. Or you can start with components, which is mostly in non-electronic games. Or you can start with constraints. I'm going to make a game of this type, and it's not going to last more than X minutes or X hours. I'm going to make a game with 55 cards, and it's going to last half an hour. That eliminates a whole lot of different kinds of games. Now, play parts of the game in your mind's eye, Reiner Knizia's term. You can learn a lot about it from that. In effect, it's the first step of playtesting, but you don't have to have made a prototype. You can do it when you're riding a train or waiting in a line or whatever. Put yourself in the place of a player, choose a stage of the game, ask yourself what's happening, what the player sees and hears, and what the player does, which is very, very important because games are about doing things, generally. This will show you a lot that you hadn't thought about, that you've left out, or that you ought to leave out before you make the prototype. So it can be very useful. And there will be games that will never get beyond this stage, because you'll find when you play it in your mind's eye that there's some big problem that you don't have a solution for, or something you just don't like. Then you need to conceive the structure of the game. And this is a game, not a story. Games consist of mechanics, not of stories. Some games include stories. For a few games, a story is a major point of play, but there always has to be mechanics. That's what a game is mechanics. Sometimes a game also has a context or skin, which can go all the way up to be a story, or it can be as simple as an excuse that has nothing actually to do with how the game plays, but it gives it some identity beyond an abstract. And I recommend that you use my 9 or now 10 structures of all games to help you get through this stage. Then you make a playable prototype, because until you play the game, you can't possibly know all the things that can be wrong with it. Even very experienced designers can't anticipate everything. The prototype doesn't have to be fancy or pretty. If it's a video game, you don't have to have a lot of graphics. You're going to change it a lot anyway. If it's a tabletop game, you don't have to write a full set of rules beforehand, as long as you've got enough notes so that when it's being played, you can figure out how it's going to work if an unanticipated situation comes up. If it's a video game, unfortunately, you have to figure it all out before you make the prototype, because you've got to write the program. Of course, you're likely to be playing solo anyway when you first play your prototype. If you plan to make a video game, a paper prototype can tell you a lot, and maybe save you a lot of time. Maybe you'll find you need drastic changes, or maybe you'll find it's just not going to work. Then you want to playtest it solo, you and anybody else who's involved in the development. Of course, that's easy with single player or simple video games. For tabletop games for 2 or more players, it can be difficult, but generally you can do it just fine. Something like deduction games might be kind of hard, but most kinds of games, if you put your mind to it, you can play solo and represent 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 players. You're not trying to see who wins. You're looking for how the game plays, for what's missing, for what's superfluous, what can be left out. It's fun testing, not bug testing, in case that's not obvious. There's a repeated cycle to play testing. You make a plan. That's conceiving your game. You execute the plan by making a prototype, and then you play the game. You monitor the results. If things don't go the way you want, you control the deviations by changing the game. Then you replan and repeat the execution. So you keep doing this in a circular form. It's incremental, a little at a time, and it's iterative, in other words, repeated. Video game people like to say iterate on it, which is really ugly, but it's a common phrase. Then you've got to have people who had nothing to do with the development play the game. People who are representative of the target audience. You as a game designer are not representative of the target audience in most cases. The other problem is people who are close to the development of the game become too accustomed to it, and they won't necessarily recognize when there's a problem, because they found a way to cope with it over a long period of development and solo testing. So you need people who have never played the game before, who are representative of the target market. And then you have to listen to what they say, and even more important, you have to watch what they do and what they don't do. Then we have blind play testing, if it's possible, and bug testing. Bug testing is to make sure the game, the software, works. Normal play testing is to make sure that the game works well and is enjoyable for the intended audience. In other words, that the design is good. Fun testing is about the design. Bug testing is about the software. So blind testing, you have people who have never heard about the game, don't know anything about it, They're given it to play. They have to figure it out themselves, just as if they bought it. And you observe or talk to them later and find out how it went. Then the last step is you have to complete the game. And this is a pain because the last 20% often takes 80% of the time. Lots of testing and modifying and testing and modifying and so on. No one wants an incomplete game, especially in the video game world, although that is changing because you have open alpha tests and open beta tests, so the game is not finished, but it's sufficiently complete for others to play. If you're trying to get a job full-time as a video game designer, you have to be able to show your potential employers that you can make complete games, even if they're not formally published. And of course, publishers want complete games. So one way or another, you've got to complete games. Taking a game halfway through and then quitting and starting another one, taking it halfway through and quitting, it just doesn't make sense. It's what you want to do. Many people end up wanting to do, but it's a bad idea. You have to complete games. Now, I've discussed this at great length in my online class, Learning Game Design. I also have a class about level and adventure design, and someday I'll have a class about succeeding as a game designer, which will address the business side of game design.